In the silence of the night, the SWAT team gathered outside the towering, dilapidated steel factory, the final stronghold of the Black Horn Syndicate. The air was heavy with tension, mingling with the sharp scent of rain-soaked concrete. Grant Johnson, dressed in tactical gear, stood at the front of the team, one hand gripping the leash of his German Shepherd Shadow. The dog stood alert, his body tense, ears twitching at every faint sound. This wasn't just another mission. It was a chance to dismantle the most dangerous criminal organization in the city. For Grant, it was also another opportunity to prove that his blindness was not a limitation, but a strength forged through resilience and trust in his loyal partner. As the team prepared to move, Captain Tom approached Grant, his face lined with concern. "Grant, this place is a trap," he warned, his voice low but firm. "It's crawling with armed guards and booby traps. If things go sideways, I need you to pull back. Don't take unnecessary risks." Grant turned his head slightly toward the captain, his expression calm yet resolute. "Tom, you know me better than that. Shadow and I don't leave things unfinished." Shadow let out a low bark, as if agreeing with his partner's words. Tom sighed, his worry evident, but he gave a curt nod before stepping back to join the team. The factory loomed ahead like a dark labyrinth, its towering steel beams casting eerie shadows under the dim moonlight. Grant crouched down beside Shadow, running his hand over the dog's head. "You ready, buddy?" he whispered. Shadow nuzzled his hand in response, his tail giving a single wag. Grant stood and gave the signal to move, his grip on Shadow's leash firm but confident. The team breached the factory gates silently, their footsteps muffled on the wet ground. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and oil, the faint echoes of dripping water adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Shadow led the way, his nose low to the ground, sniffing for any trace of explosives or hidden enemies. Grant relied entirely on the dog's signals, listening intently to every shuffle and change in Shadow's posture. Suddenly, Shadow froze, his body stiffening as he let out a quiet, guttural growl. Grant immediately raised his hand, signaling the team to stop. "What is it, Shadow?" he murmured, crouching slightly to feel the dog's stance. Shadow's head turned toward a pile of debris ahead, his ears pricked and his nose twitching. Grant knelt, his gloved hands brushing over the ground until he found the edge of a metallic object hidden under the rubble. His fingers traced the unmistakable shape of a pressure-triggered mine. Grant's heart pounded as he spoke into his radio. "We've got a mine up ahead. Disarming now." A member of the bomb squad moved forward cautiously, taking over the delicate task. The team held their breath as the minutes stretched on, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint clicks of tools. Finally, the specialist gave a thumbs up, and the team exhaled in unison. Shadow's tail wagged slightly, sensing the danger had passed. Grant gave him a quiet pat. "Good work, boy. Let's keep going." The deeper they moved into the factory, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The steel beams seemed to close in, and every creak of the structure sent a shiver down the spine. Shadow remained alert, his movements precise and deliberate, guiding Grant through the maze of machinery and abandoned crates. But just as the team rounded a corner, chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed from above as syndicate members opened fire from the catwalks. "Ambush!" someone shouted, and the team scattered for cover. Shadow reacted instantly, pulling Grant behind a stack of steel barrels as bullets ricocheted off the metal. Grant's breathing was steady, his ears straining to pick up the direction of the shooters. "Shadow, stay close," he commanded. The dog pressed against his leg, his body a shield of unwavering loyalty. Grant tilted his head, focusing on the faint echo of footsteps on the catwalk. "They're moving left," he called into his radio. "Take the flanks." The SWAT team followed his lead, maneuvering to outsmart their attackers. Shadow let out a low growl, signaling that one of the shooters was directly above them. Grant gripped his sidearm, waiting for the perfect moment. As the footsteps paused, Shadow barked sharply, and Grant fired, the shot echoing as the shooter's weapon clattered to the ground. The gunfire eventually subsided as the team neutralized the attackers. The air was thick with smoke and adrenaline, but there was no time to rest. Shadow tugged at Grant's leash, urging him forward. Grant gave the signal to advance, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Let's move. Shadow's got something." As the dust settled from the ambush, Grant Johnson took a deep breath, steadying himself. Shadow pressed against his leg, his body tense but ready, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit factory for any remaining threats. The air inside the steel factory was thick with the smell of gunpowder and rust, the tension hanging heavy over the team as they regrouped. Grant could feel the faint vibrations of footsteps in the distance, echoing through the labyrinth of machinery and steel beams. Shadow nudged his hand gently, grounding him in the present moment. "Good work, boy," Grant whispered, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "But we're not done yet." Shadow wagged his tail once, a silent acknowledgement that the bond between them was as strong as ever. The SWAT team gathered near the base of a rusted staircase, weapons drawn, their breaths visible in the cold, damp air. Captain Tom's voice crackled through the radio. "Johnson, we've got reports of a hidden chamber deeper in the factory. Intel says that's where they're keeping the hostages and the shipment." His tone was firm but cautious, a reminder of the stakes. Grant adjusted his grip on Shadow's leash, his face calm and unreadable. "Understood," he replied. "Shadow will find it." There was no hesitation in his voice, only trust in his partner. The team moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled against the grime-covered floor. Shadow led the way, his nose low to the ground, sniffing for any traces of danger. The labyrinthine corridors of the factory were suffocating, each turn revealing towering stacks of machinery and steel crates that could easily conceal traps or enemies. Grant relied entirely on Shadow's instincts, every change in the dog's posture communicating volumes. Shadow's ears flicked forward, and he stopped abruptly, growling low. Grant crouched beside him, his hand brushing the ground, until he felt a faint wire stretched across the walkway. "Tripwire," he murmured into the radio. "Stay back." As the bomb squad moved to disarm the wire, Grant listened intently to the distant sounds around them. The faint clatter of metal and hurried footsteps confirmed what he already knew. The syndicate was watching them, preparing for their next move. Shadow, ever alert, nudged Grant's knee, signaling him to stay low. Grant whispered, "You hear them too, don't you?" Shadow's response was a quiet growl, his eyes locked on the shadows ahead. The tension was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity as the team worked methodically to secure the area. The corridor opened into a large chamber, the space illuminated by flickering industrial lights hanging from the high ceilings. The room was filled with towering stacks of crates, some marked with foreign symbols that hinted at the illegal operations the syndicate was running. Shadow's movements became sharper, more deliberate as he sniffed the air. He tugged slightly on the leash, guiding Grant toward the far side of the chamber. The SWAT team fanned out, their weapons raised, scanning every corner for threats. Suddenly, Shadow froze, his body rigid, his head tilting toward a faint noise, a muffled cry. Grant's heart quickened as he listened closely, picking up the sound of voices on the other side of a steel door. Shadow let out a soft bark, his tail stiff, confirming what Grant already suspected. "Hostages," he said quietly into his radio. "They're in there," Captain Tom's voice came through immediately. "We'll breach. Be ready." The SWAT team positioned themselves around the door, their movements silent and precise. Shadow stood at Grant's side, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to act at a moment's notice. Grant knelt beside him, placing a hand on the dog's head. "This is it, buddy," he whispered. "Stay close." Shadow's ears twitched, his gaze unwavering. The team counted down, and with a deafening crash, the steel door was forced open. Chaos erupted as the team stormed the room. The chamber beyond was cramped and dimly lit, with armed guards scrambling to defend their position. Gunfire rang out, the sharp cracks echoing off the walls. Shadow moved like a shadow himself, weaving through the chaos with precision. Grant followed his cues, trusting every bark, every nudge, as the room became a blur of movement and noise. In the corner of the room, a group of hostages huddled together, their hands bound, their faces pale with fear. Shadow darted toward them, barking sharply to signal their location. Grant followed, his heart pounding as he knelt beside the terrified group. "You're safe now," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "Stay low and follow Shadow. He'll get you out." Shadow led the hostages toward the exit, his tail wagging slightly as if to reassure them. Despite the chaos, he moved with purpose, his every action a testament to the trust between him and Grant. As the last hostage was escorted out, Grant's earpiece crackled with Tom's voice. "Johnson, we've got movement in the upper levels. They're trying to escape with the shipment. Can you intercept?" Grant's jaw tightened. "We're on it," he replied. Shadow returned to his side, his body low and tense, ready for the next challenge. The upper levels of the factory were a maze of narrow walkways and precarious catwalks. Shadow's nose led the way, his every movement calculated. Grant followed, his other senses heightened, listening for the faintest sound of footsteps or the creak of shifting metal. Suddenly, Shadow stopped, growling low. Grant felt the change in the air. A figure was moving ahead of them. "Shadow, stay," he whispered, raising his weapon. The figure lunged from the shadows, but before Grant could act, Shadow was already on him, knocking the attacker to the ground with a forceful leap. As the team secured the suspect and the shipment, the adrenaline began to fade. Grant knelt beside Shadow, running his hand over the dog's head. "We did it, partner," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet pride. Shadow nuzzled him in response, his tail wagging gently. The bond between them had carried them through yet another impossible mission, proving once again that together they were unstoppable. As the dust from the raid settled, the echo of footsteps faded, and the last hostage was led to safety. Grant Johnson leaned against the cold steel of the catwalk railing, his hand resting on Shadow's head. The tension of the raid still coursed through his veins, but there was no time to reflect. His earpiece crackled to life with Captain Tom's voice, steady yet urgent. "Grant, the syndicate leader is holed up in the main control room on the upper level. He's barricaded himself with the shipment. We can't afford to lose him or the evidence. It's on you and Shadow." Grant nodded, though the captain couldn't see it. "Understood," he replied calmly, tightening his grip on Shadow's leash. The German shepherd's ears twitched, his body tensing as if he could sense the weight of what was coming. "Let's finish this, buddy," Grant murmured, crouching down to meet Shadow's intense gaze. The dog responded with a low growl of anticipation, his tail still, his focus absolute. Grant and Shadow moved swiftly but cautiously through the maze of the factory's upper levels. The catwalks were narrow, suspended high above the factory floor, and creaked ominously with every step. The air was colder here, biting against Grant's skin, and the distant hum of machinery added to the oppressive atmosphere. Shadow took the lead, his nose to the ground, weaving through the labyrinth with purpose. Every muscle in Grant's body was coiled like a spring, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge as he relied entirely on his partner to guide him. Suddenly, Shadow stopped, his body rigid, his head tilted toward a faint noise up ahead. Grant knelt beside him, one hand on Shadow's flank, feeling the dog's muscles tremble with tension. In the stillness, Grant could hear it too. The faint shuffle of footsteps, the subtle click of a weapon being readied. Shadow growled softly, his tail stiff. "I hear them," Grant whispered. "They're waiting for us." Grant reached for his radio, speaking in a hushed tone. "Tom, "We've got movement ahead. I'll engage." Tom's reply crackled through the static. "Copy that. Be careful, Johnson. The leader's desperate. He won't go down easy." Grant exhaled slowly, steadying himself. With a tap of Shadow's leash, the pair advanced silently. They reached the main control room door, a heavy steel barrier with a faint glow of light seeping through the cracks. Shadow sniffed at the base of the door, his ears twitching, then let out a low, sharp bark. It was his signal. Someone was inside, and the tension in his body told Grant there was more than one person. Grant placed a gloved hand on the door, feeling its cold surface. "Shadow, ready," he whispered. The dog shifted, his body low to the ground, poised to strike. Grant pressed his radio again. "We're breaching the control room." The team below confirmed they were standing by, but Grant knew this was on him and Shadow. With a sharp command, "Shadow, back!" the dog retreated a few feet as Grant planted a small, breaching charge on the door. The explosion was sharp and sudden, the steel door flying inward with a deafening crash. Chaos erupted as the room came into view. Inside, the syndicate leader stood near a stack of crates, a weapon in hand and desperation etched across his face. Two armed guards flanked him, their movements frantic as they scrambled for cover. Shadow launched forward, a blur of fur and power, targeting one of the guards with precision. The man cried out as Shadow's jaws clamped down on his arm, disarming him with a forceful yank. Grant moved with practiced confidence, using the echoes of footsteps and shouts to track the remaining guard. A faint shuffle to his left gave away the man's position, and Grant fired, the shot striking the weapon from the guard's hand before he could retaliate. The room was a cacophony of sound, shouts, the clang of metal, and the sharp bark of Shadow, who had turned his focus to the syndicate leader. The leader, realizing he was cornered, shouted, "Stay back! I'll destroy everything!" His voice was shaky, but the defiance in his tone was clear. Grant could hear the tension in the man's breathing, the way his movements were hurried but deliberate. Shadow growled, advancing slowly, his gaze locked on the man. Grant raised his voice, calm but commanding. "It's over. Shadow and I have you surrounded. Put the weapon down before this gets worse." The leader hesitated, his grip on the weapon faltering as Shadow crept closer, his growl low and menacing. Grant took a step forward, his senses attuned to every sound. "You've got nowhere to go," he continued, his voice steady. "Whatever you're holding on to, it's not worth your life." For a moment, the room was still, the tension almost unbearable. Then, with a frustrated growl, the leader dropped the weapon, raising his hands in surrender. "Call him off!" he shouted. Grant gave the command. "Shadow, hold!" The dog froze, his body rigid but still, his gaze never leaving the leader. Grant moved quickly, securing the man with zip ties as Shadow remained at his side, his presence a silent reminder of the danger that had just been neutralized. As the room quieted, Grant's earpiece crackled. "Johnson's status?" Grant exhaled, his hand brushing over Shadow's head. "Control room secure, leader in custody." Evidence intact. Tom's relief was evident in his voice. "Good work, Grant. Bring him in." As the SWAT team moved in to secure the area, Grant knelt beside Shadow, running his hand through the dog's fur. "You were perfect, buddy," he murmured, his voice soft but filled with pride. Shadow nuzzled him in response, his tail wagging gently. Together they left the control room, the weight of their victory settling over them. For Grant, it wasn't just about completing the mission. It was about proving once again that he and Shadow were an unstoppable team, no matter the odds. The steel factory, with its echoes of chaos and desperation, was now a silent testament to their courage and trust. As the steel factory lay behind them, a scene of chaos transformed into triumph. Grant, Johnson, and Shadow walked side by side through the cold, damp air of the precinct garage. The adrenaline still hummed in Grant's veins, but the faint ache in his legs reminded him of the night's grueling ordeal. Shadow trotted confidently, his tail wagging slightly, but his ever-alert gaze swept the area as if still in mission mode. Grant couldn't help but let his hand graze the top of Shadow's head. A silent thank you to the partner who had once again brought him through the impossible. The precinct buzzed with activity as they entered. Officers paused in their work to glance at Grant and Shadow, their faces a mix of admiration and curiosity. Whispers trailed them, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakable. Respect, tinged with lingering disbelief. Grant wasn't blind to the undercurrent of doubt that still followed him, but he'd grown accustomed to it. Tonight, though, the whispers carried a different energy, one he couldn't quite place. Shadow pressed close to his side, his presence grounding Grant in the moment. Captain Tom appeared at the far end of the room, his broad shoulders framed by the harsh fluorescent light. His usual gruff expression softened when he saw them. "Johnson," he called out, motioning for Grant to follow him into his office. "We need to talk." Grant nodded, giving Shadow a quick pat as they moved toward Tom's office. The small room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the cluttered desk a reflection of Tom's perpetual workload. Tom leaned against the edge of the desk, folding his arms as he studied Grant. Shadow sat at Grant's feet, his ears twitching as if he, too, was listening intently. "That was one hell of a mission," Tom began, his voice low and serious. "You and Shadow, you outdid yourselves tonight. Taking down the leader, securing the evidence, rescuing the hostages. Not a single casualty on your team. That's no small feat." Grant tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "We were just doing our job," he replied simply, though there was a quiet pride in his tone. "Shadow did most of the work." Tom smirked. "Yeah, well, you both make quite a team. But you know this isn't the end of it. The trial's coming up fast, and Judge Willie's already making noise about your testimony. He's not done trying to rattle you." The mention of Willie made Grant's jaw tighten. He had faced skeptics his entire career, but Willie was different. The judge's sharp tongue and relentless doubt weren't just about Grant's abilities. They were personal. Grant could feel it in every snide remark, every pointed question. "Let him try," Grant said, his voice calm but firm. "Shadow and I have faced worse than his sarcasm." Tom studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I figured you'd say that. Just keep your head on straight. Willie's not just looking to question your abilities. He's looking for a crack, any excuse to discredit you." Grant gave a small nod, his hand instinctively resting on Shadow's head. "He won't find one. Shadow and I don't break." Tom's expression softened. "I know you don't. But you've got people in your corner, Johnson. Roxy's already making sure the prosecution is airtight, and you've got a whole precinct behind you, whether you realize it or not." Grant allowed himself a faint smile, one hand brushing over Shadow's fur. "Thanks, Tom. That means more than you know." As Grant left the office, the weight of the conversation lingered. Shadow trotted beside him, his presence a steady reassurance. The precinct had quieted slightly, the late hour leaving only a skeleton crew on duty. Grant could hear the faint clatter of keyboards, the murmur of voices, and the occasional shuffle of papers. Shadow's nails clicked softly against the tile floor as they made their way to the exit. The cold night air hit Grant's face as they stepped outside, the world outside the precinct calm and still. The silence was a stark contrast to the chaos of the steel factory. But Grant's mind was far from quiet. Willie's doubt still echoed in his thoughts, the judge's sharp words a constant reminder of the uphill battle Grant faced, not just in court, but in proving his worth to those who couldn't see past his blindness. Shadow nudged Grant's leg, pulling him from his thoughts. Grant knelt beside him, resting his forehead against the dog's head for a brief moment. "What would I do without you, huh?" he murmured. Shadow gave a soft whine, his tail thumping lightly against the ground. Grant chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Yeah, I know. We've got this." Just as they turned toward the parking lot, a familiar voice called out. "Grant!" Roxy's quick footsteps echoed against the pavement as she caught up with them, her breath visible in the crisp night air. Grant tilted his head slightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Roxy, what brings you here at this hour?" She stopped in front of him, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "I wanted to make sure you're okay after tonight. That raid was intense." Grant shrugged lightly. "It's nothing Shadow and I haven't handled before, but thanks for checking." Roxy folded her arms, her gaze steady. "You know Willie's going to come after you hard in court, right? He's not just questioning your abilities, he's questioning your right to wear the badge." Grant's smile faded, replaced by a calm resolve. "Let him. He doesn't get to decide what I'm capable of. Shadow and I prove ourselves every day." Roxy nodded, a small smile breaking through her serious expression. "Well, for what it's worth, I've got your back. And so does the entire prosecution team. You're not alone in this." Grant nodded in appreciation, his grip on Shadow's leash tightening slightly. "Thanks, Roxy. That means a lot." As she watched them walk away, Roxy couldn't help but feel a swell of respect for the man and his dog. There was something unshakable about them, a quiet strength that demanded recognition. She knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that Grant and Shadow were ready for whatever came their way. Together, they were unstoppable. As the morning sun cast its golden light across the courthouse steps, Grant Johnson and Shadow stood together, a picture of quiet strength. The raid was behind them, the evidence secured, and the criminals in custody, yet Grant knew the hardest part was still to come. The courtroom, with its sterile walls and skeptical gazes, awaited them. For Grant, it wasn't just a place of justice, it was a battlefield where he and Shadow would once again have to prove their worth. But as he adjusted the leash in his hand, feeling the gentle pull of Shadow at his side, he found comfort in the unbreakable bond they shared. It wasn't just a partnership, it was a lifeline built on trust, love, and an unshakable belief in one another. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Willie sat at the bench, his sharp eyes scanning the room, his expression as unreadable as ever. Lawyers murmured among themselves, the jury exchanged quiet glances, and spectators filled the gallery, eager to witness the next chapter of Grant's story. Shadow sat calmly by Grant's feet, his ears twitching as if attuned to the emotions swirling around them. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath as Grant rose to take the witness stand, Shadow following his every step with precision. Judge Willie's voice broke the silence, his tone as biting as ever. "Officer Johnson, it's not every day we have a blind officer testifying in a case like this. Tell me, how exactly do you plan to convince this court that your observations, if we can call them that, are reliable?" His words were met with scattered murmurs, a ripple of doubt spreading through the room. Grant paused, his hand brushing over Shadow's head as he steadied himself. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but resolute. "Your Honor, I don't see the world the way you do, but I've spent my entire career learning to see in ways that go beyond sight. Shadow is my eyes, my partner, and my protector. Together we've faced situations most people can't imagine, and time again we've proven that trust, training, and instinct are more powerful than any limitation." The room fell silent, the weight of Grant's words hanging in the air. Even Judge Willie seemed momentarily taken aback, his usual smirk replaced by a contemplative expression. But he wasn't ready to concede. "Trust and instinct are all well and good, Sergeant," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But this court deals in facts. How can you expect us to place our faith in something we can't see or quantify?" Grant smiled faintly, his grip on Shadow's leash tightening. "Your Honor, not everything worth believing in can be seen. Shadow and I have saved lives, people who wouldn't be here today if we hadn't trusted each other completely. You might not understand our bond, and that's okay. What matters is that it works. The evidence we brought to this court is proof of that." As Grant spoke, Shadow let out a soft bark, as if punctuating his words. A murmur of admiration swept through the gallery, and even the jury seemed to sit up a little straighter, their doubt giving way to respect. Roxy, seated at the prosecution table, watched with a mixture of pride and relief. She had always believed in Grant, but seeing him stand tall in the face of such relentless skepticism reaffirmed her faith in him. By the time Grant finished his testimony, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The doubt that had once lingered in the air was replaced by a quiet sense of awe. Judge Willie, though still guarded, seemed to soften slightly, his sharp words replaced by thoughtful silence. As Grant returned to his seat, Shadow trotting faithfully by his side, the room erupted in quiet applause, a rare and spontaneous acknowledgement of his courage. Outside the courthouse, the crisp winter air felt like a balm against Grant's skin. He knelt beside Shadow, running a hand through the dog's fur. "We did it, buddy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Shadow nuzzled him in response, his tail wagging gently. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Roxy joined them on the steps, her coat wrapped tightly around her against the chill. "Grant," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you've done more than prove your point. You've shown everyone in that room what true courage looks like." Grant smiled, standing to face her. "It's not about proving a point, Roxy. It's about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is." As they stood there, the courthouse looming behind them, Grant felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The battle wasn't over. There would always be more challenges, more doubters, more mountains to climb. But today, he and Shadow had shown that strength isn't measured by sight, but by heart. The story of Grant Johnson and his loyal dog, Shadow, is not just about a dangerous mission. It's a testament to the power of determination and trust. Despite losing his sight, Grant refused to let it define his limits. He adapted, sharpened his other senses, and relied on Shadow to complete his mission. This reminds us that challenges are not roadblocks, but opportunities to discover our inner strength. The unbreakable trust between Grant and Shadow allowed them to overcome every danger. Shadow's loyalty and Grant's resilience proved that ability is not just about sight. It's about intelligence, courage, and believing in oneself. When society doubted his capabilities, Grant didn't argue. He proved himself through action. This story teaches us that nothing is impossible when we have determination and perseverance. Sometimes the only limits we have are the ones we set for ourselves. By trusting ourselves and those who stand by our side, we can overcome any obstacle and achieve success.